In this video, we'll take a look at inflation and unemployment, the twin evils of macroeconomics. Both inflation and unemployment are key indicators of an economy's performance. Therefore, we should pay attention to these when making our investment decisions. Inflation is defined as a sustained rise in most prices in the economy. The inflation rate is the rate at which prices are rising. It is much easier to define inflation than to measure it. Each month, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS for short, in America checks prices on 90,000 items on more than 23,000 retail and service outlets. The BLS checks prices only in urban areas, because prices are liable to be different in different regions. The BLS must check prices on the same items in every part of the country. The result of all this effort is the predominant measure of the cost of living in the United States, the Consumer Price Index, or CPI for short. The CPI measures the average change over time in the prices paid by urban consumers for a market basket of consumer goods and services. The BLS computes the CPI for each month. To calculate inflation, we must first compute CPI. Consider a simple example where the typical household in the economy consumes 5 packages of cheese and 8 boxes of crackers in a month. If the price of cheese rises to $2.25 from $2, and the price of crackers climbs to $1.5 from $1.25, then the CPI rises to 116.25 from 100. The calculations are shown below. The assumption is that period 1 is a base period, the period to which all other periods are compared. To find the rate of inflation, we simply have to find the rate of change in CPI between any two periods. In this example, that will be 16.25%, as shown below. In the real world, however, many complications may arise when calculating the CPI that are not apparent in this simple example. For instance, what should be done when the quality of a product changes? The price of automobiles has risen dramatically since the 1950s, but so has the quality of the product. The new car these days come with seatbelts and airbags, safety devices that were not available in earlier versions of the product. Quality improvements such as this account for some portion of the price increase. The CPI overstates the amount of inflation since it does not account for all quality improvements. This is just one example of how the CPI can overstate cost of living increases. A 1996 study from a bipartisan commission concluded that the CPI overstates inflation by more than 1 percentage point a year. The discrepancy is important because most income maintenance programs, such as Social Security, adjust their benefit payments with the CPI. Inflation can be measured with another statistic, the GDP deflator. In previous videos, we've discussed how GDP and real GDP are calculated. Both of these statistics can be used to obtain the GDP deflator through a simple formula. The GDP deflator equals to GDP over real GDP times 100. In 2016, the gross domestic product was $18,569.1 billion US dollars, while real GDP equaled $16,662.1 billion. Therefore, the GDP deflator for 2016 was 111.4. To calculate the inflation rate between any 2 years, simply take the percentage change in the GDP deflator. Given that the GDP deflator in 2006 was 94.8, we know that the inflation rate between 2006 and 2016 was 17.5%. The GDP deflator, like the CPI, measures the level of prices in the economy. The inflation rates derived from the GDP deflator, however, do not match the inflation rates obtained from the CPI. Both inflation gauges suggest the same general pattern of inflation over the years. The GDP deflator ignores import prices. If the price of imported beer increased, the CPI will rise in response, but not the GDP deflator. Still, for most years, the CPI and the GDP deflator do not differ markedly. Many people think that the most damaging aspect of inflation is that it erodes purchasing power. It is true that any household whose income does not keep pace with inflation will be hurt, but for the vast majority of households, incomes keep pace with, if not exceed, price increases. This is because if the prices paid for goods and services produced by firms increases, firms take in more revenue, If this revenue is not passed back to households in the form of higher wages or rent, the firms make more profits. But someone owns the firms and the profits become their income. More specifically, the profits are returned to households in the form of dividends. So higher prices always translate into higher levels of income. But even if a household's income rises as fast as prices, inflation can still be detrimental. This is because the value of savings accounts, trust funds, and other forms of financial wealth will be worth less than before the inflation. In other words, inflation erodes the purchasing power of savings. Savings play a crucial role in the economy. Households, businesses, and governments often need to borrow funds. Inflation discourages savings. Another problem with inflation is the resources that are wasted dealing with higher prices. Firms have to print new brochures, restaurants need to produce new menus, and price lists in all the media will have to be revised. This takes time and effort. Resources that could have been used more productively are deployed to cope with rising prices. This misallocation of resources because of inflation is sometimes called menu costs. A final issue associated with inflation has to do with borrowing and lending in inflationary conditions. Lenders can be hurt by inflation because the dollars they loaned out are repaid at a later date with dollars that are not worth as much because of inflation. Imagine lending a friend $100 for a year at 10% interest. A year later, the friend repays you $110. But suppose prices have risen 12% over the course of the loan, your $110 could not even buy what your $100 could a year ago. By the same token, borrowers could benefit from inflation because they get to repay their borrowings with inflated dollars. Why don't banks get hurt by inflation? Aren't they big lenders? They are, but they're also smart enough to add an inflation surcharge onto the interest rate that they charge. When the bank lends $100 to your friend, it might charge 22%, 10% for his real return, and 12% to cover the cost of inflation that he expects over the course of the loan. The idea that some lenders will protect themselves from inflation by charging higher interest on loans was codified into a formula by Irving Fisher in the early 1900s. The formula is known as Fisher's hypothesis. It states that nominal interest rate equals to real interest rate plus expected inflation. The nominal interest rate is the rate actually paid. The real interest rate is the actual return the lender receives net of inflation. If you really think about it, inflation works just like a tax, because households are major lenders and the government is a major borrower. It's as if Uncle Sam reaches into your wallet every night while you sleep and slips out just a little cash so that you don't even notice. The inflation tax is the result of the federal government benefiting from inflation while households are harmed. This redistribution of wealth from lenders to borrowers is yet another cause of inflation. Unemployment occurs when the economy is operating below its potential. Our most important resource is labor. Unemployment exists when this resource is not being fully utilized. The costs associated with unemployment are obvious. Households will encounter hardships, maybe even hunger. Unemployment means that a resource, labor, is not being used to its fullest potential. We're producing inside the production possibilities frontier. We could be producing more and enjoying more goods and services. Unemployment is a problem during recessions, periods when the real GDP is declining. During a recession, fewer goods and services are being produced. The amount of labor and other resources required for production is reduced, and people find themselves out of work. The unemployment rate is defined as the number of unemployed persons divided by the labor force. The labor force does not include retired persons, those too young to work, and anyone who has not been actively seeking employment. In order to be counted as unemployed, you have to be out of work and looking for a job. That said, economists classify the unemployed into 5 general categories. First, those who are able to work but not actively seeking employment because they're discouraged about their prospects for finding employment are referred to as discouraged workers or the hidden unemployed. This situation is unfortunate because these people lack basic skills, suffer from other problems, and have a difficult time finding work. Discouraged by their prospects, they no longer bother to pursue employment. These people do not show up in the unemployment statistics because they are not considered to be part of the labor force, thus the name hidden unemployment. Another form of unemployment that does not show up in the official statistics is structural unemployment. The structurally unemployed are out of work because the economy is structured or set up to their disadvantage. For instance, there may be welders looking for a job in Cleveland, While all the welding jobs are in Dallas, welders may be out of work in Boston, but there are plenty of secretarial jobs in the same area. Since it's often difficult for a person to relocate or retrain, structural unemployment is not easily remedied. Third, some persons are able to find work for only a portion of the year due to the seasonal nature of their jobs. These individuals are considered to be seasonally unemployed, as long as they actively look for work in the off-season. Farmers and construction workers may fall into this category. Fourth, as mentioned previously, unemployment rises during the contractionary phase of the business cycle. Individuals who lose their jobs during a recession and the corresponding slowdown in production are said to be cyclically unemployed. They are out of work specifically because of the business cycle. Hopefully, these people will be back to work when production picks up during the next expansion. Finally, a number of persons are not working because they're in between jobs. Someone who is scheduled to begin a new job next month and does not presently hold a job is considered to be frictionally unemployed. It is unlikely that people will be able to switch jobs without some time off. Indeed, some people take advantage of this time to relax with their households and get their affairs in order. Also, someone who quits one job to look for another is considered to be frictionally unemployed as well. Finally, new entrants into the labor market, such as graduates looking for work or stay-at-home parent re-entering the workforce, are also considered to be frictionally unemployed. To summarize, inflation and unemployment are serious economic problems. Inflation causes the misallocation of resources and an arbitrary redistribution of income. Inflation is typically a problem when the economy is overheated, growing faster than normal. But inflation can also occur during recessions. Unemployment occurs when the economy is operating below its potential. Our most important resource is labor, and unemployment exists when this resource is not being fully utilized. We have reviewed the major statistics that measure unemployment and inflation and found that they are not perfectly accurate. It is important to understand how the new numbers are generated so that their potential deficiencies can be anticipated. For instance, if the price of imported oil is rising rapidly, it is critical to know that the GDP deflator will not reflect this increase. The GDP deflator does not include the prices of imported products. The CPI does. The most important question concerning inflation and unemployment has been ignored, and that is what causes inflation and unemployment. A complete answer will be provided in following videos.